Praise the Lord, guys. I'm Shaw Greenhorn. And behold, a certain woman with an issue of infirmity, 18 years, who was bowed down and could in no wise lift herself up. When Jesus saw her, he called her to himself and said, Woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. Now the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day. Therefore he said unto all the people, There are 6 days in which men ought to work. Come in them therefore and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. But Jesus answered and rebuked him, saying, Thou hypocrite, which of you shall have his ox or ass on the Sabbath day in the stall and not loose him and lead him away to watering? So here we have a follow-up parable compared to the parable of the fig tree that did not produce, his Lord coming through it 3 years seeking fruit thereon. So now we understood that, but first of all, this parable is right after that one. We understand that the message from that one was how something is being expected of us. But it's amazing that he puts this right next to that one, because this also shows the mercy of God, the understanding, of the Lord, how he's so dynamic. That's why you can't predict God. There's so many sides to him, and he considers all things, because he is the righteous judge. And I think sometimes we worry that we can get lost in the cracks. He just got done explaining to them, consider the ravens, they sow not, they reap not, neither have they barns or storehouses. Consider the lilies, they spin not, they toil not. How God is so mindful of them. So, with this, he's stripping down layer by layer the mind of God, showing how he thinks. Because, one can't, stand up and say that God knows everything. One can say that God thinks of everything, that he's aware of everything, that he's everywhere, and he's all powerful, all knowing, and all these things. But then, without specific examples, then we are left to wonder. And this is showing unto us a real live play by play into how he thinks and how he looks, how specific he is. Because this is done as a follow-up to that parable, I would say, to not leave you with an angry God who's just so vengeful, and you have one last chance and you better not mess up. How even in his own rules, how he can have consideration, of compassion, righteous judgment, for those afflicted. And how he doesn't hold everyone to the same standard. He just got done telling them that to whom much is given, much is required, and to whom men have committed much, they will ask them more. So in this parable, we see him. Well, this isn't a parable, something that happened. The parable of the fig tree, that was a parable. A story in theory used to emphasize certain things. But now, God in his wisdom allowed this story to come next. So we see, how this woman is being mentioned, right? A certain woman, and how she had this infirmity at 18 years. She was bowed down, could in no wise lift herself. So, we know that demons, they cause diseases. We know that diseases come from other things, from mutations. I would ask the question, does every disease have a spirit behind it? Is there some diseases that they just happen? And if you were to look at the underlying, just like baseline of what's causing this thing, is there always a spirit there? I would ask that question. Is there always a spirit behind every disease? Is there never a disease that just happens and it just happened because it's just a pathology of the body, and that's all it is? Nothing caused it. Nothing is underlying it. Keep it going. Nothing is orchestrating it. Because looking at this woman, we see that she's bent over, right, bowed down. It's described, and how she could in no wise lift herself. So we see her in a state past recovery. This thing had taken her over, and how she couldn't lift herself up, that implies that she needs someone to lift her up. And sadly, she was not in an environment where she could be healed, because he's in the synagogue, not right. The preceding verse said that, and he was in one of the synagogues teaching on the Sabbath day. So what's the point of the house of God if this woman can be in there, and she's been there for 18 years, and she's stuck with this thing, and unable to get relief, unable to get deliverance? What kind of hospital would a hospital be if people came there and they came there for this same amount of years and nothing changed? It just get worse and worse each time. What would you say of a hospital like that? The house of God at this point has lost its reputation. It has lost what it was supposed to be about. We have these religious leaders being cowboys, running off, teaching for doctrine the commandments of men, emphasizing foolishness, the washing of the hands, how they accuse Jesus, even healing on the Sabbath, they're about to accuse, if they were unable to, right? And this was their job. Don't you think that the most important question they could ask is, how did you heal this woman? Instead of being upset and wanting to, shame Jesus for doing what they could not do. Now this woman, she was in such a place, she couldn't lift herself up. Sometimes in life, we get to a place where we do need a helping hand. We do need somebody that's, past where we are to reach back and lift us up. You remember what he said at the end of the world? You saw me hungry, you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was naked, you clothed me. A stranger, you took me in. I was in prison, you came unto me, and in sick, and you came to minister unto me. So no, this is all reaching back and, helping. And I will always say, compare that to what he said to the others. Depart from me, I know thee not. Many shall say unto me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in thy streets, cast out devils, and preach and do all these things? See, we're about to see this, ruler of the synagogue about to make the same mistake. Emphasizing the doctrine part. He's even about to, pull rank on Jesus, saying he's out of line for having broken the Sabbath. So, we can see the lining of what God is expecting us to follow, what he's expecting us to be like, right? So 18 years. So at one point she was okay. Her age is not told. You know, was she 18 years old? Was she born with it? You would kind of imply, no, that it came on at some point. So now you'd have to look at the family history. Does anybody else have this? Mother, father, siblings, grandparents, or distant relatives? Is this thing something that runs in the family? You'd have to also question her. What are some of her practices? Did she bring this on herself? Engaging in something dangerous like witchcraft, or did any inciting event happen to bring this on? So we see, the Lord, when he saw her, how he called her to him and told her that thou art loose from thine infirmity. So now we see the eyes of Jesus. I think his eyes are different. When he walks through the crowd, he sees those in need. He sees the beggar man. He sees the blind man. He sees this woman bent over. How were they treating this woman? Were they walking on the other side of the room when she was there? Were they talking about her? No doubt maybe she couldn't, bathe herself as well. Was she smelly? Was this a topic of discussion? Did the people look down on her that much? Because, these religious leaders, how they would favor the rich and, shame the poor, treat them lowly. We see the striking difference in the heart of Jesus right here. How he saw her and he called her to him. While everybody else is trying to get away from her, he's calling her. And, that's a double shame on this ruler of the synagogue. I think that all these commandments and the Levitical Moses laws, it just ended up hardening their hearts. Because, what it did is it showed how, when given all these rules, these were the things that were expected. All right, so they were willing to do that. They were not willing to go past the rules. Much about compassion was not really emphasized in the law of Moses, apart from, if you have wronged somebody, you got to make restitution. And that's on you because you did something wrong. If your, animal killed his, how the dead one is yours, and then you got to either, they would either have to sell the live one and divide the price, or the live one would become, the man's who's destroyed, thy neighbor's wife. The Levitical laws, it emphasized when you did wrong. I know, compassion, I think, apart from, thou shalt not glean the corners of thy field, leave it for the poor and needy. We didn't really see, much, being given unto them. So, I mean, I guess you could say that that's understandable. It wasn't really emphasized. But then, it's not, those that go over and beyond the ones that find success. I mean, if you're looking at the bare minimum and just keeping up with that, how, far are you likely to go? And, it shows how they were doing the bare minimum, because these things, they were not really mentioned. So they didn't see the need to do these things. So, when he saw her, he called her to him, and how he, gave this such a statement, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. So now here's Jesus declaring before this woman, the master of faith, demonstrating faith here. To speak those things that are not as though they are, even so shall they be. How he said, men shall give account for every word spoken, idly, whether it be good or bad. So here he is declaring this thing, the power of the spoken word. And now his word is different, right? Because this is, God in the flesh. The word, the very word that was made flesh, and the authority given him. So, he's operating from something different here. When he saw her, he called her to him, right? And then how he laid his hands on her, and she was straightened immediately and glorified God. So now we see a follow-up with a contact of touching. Now we know that Jesus, he's not limited, by touch. The woman with the issue of blood, she touched the hem of his garment. She didn't even touch his body. Those 10 lepers, he told them to go and present themselves unto the priest. And, as they went, they were healed. He didn't, pronounce anything over them. He didn't touch them, didn't anoint them with the clay and told them to go wash. So, Jesus, he, decides how he chooses to heal. I wonder if these things are given unto him, or he just, freestyles. I would ask that question. Is there like, a heart string connected to the Father, But the father is letting him know, okay, you said it, all right, now lay hands on her. Whereas with those others, how he just told them to go wash. How, even with like, the myriad of other things that he's done, how differently he heals someone. So now, I would ask the question, if he did not lay hands on her and he just said, woman, thou art loose from thine infirmity, what state would she have been in? Would she have still, risen up? Was this a two step, healing? Like I said, it seems as if he has, the power to call on whatever, outcome, whatever means, to get to that outcome. So he laid his hands. So now what he said is not mentioned. Did he say anything? Maybe thou art loose from that infirmity was the prayer first, and then he just touched her and how she was made straight immediately. So, no doubt this was, a sight to behold, right? How amazed, she must have been. I always ask the question for things like this, do we see a step by step of straightening up everything, right? Do we see when the arms are folded, the legs and the back is bent over? Do we see a gradual like straightening of the back, the neck, the head being upright, the arms being straightened out, and the legs? Do we see if the head was turned to the side? Even that, coming to the center. Do we see, how was getting up and walking for her? Was she able to walk? It said that she was bent over, right? Couldn't, wise lifted herself up. Was she like able to walk stooped down? To the ground. I have seen people, with whatever caused them to be able to be like that. I have seen people move around looking like that. Immediately she was made straight. No further issue needed. So then we see this ruler of the synagogue, him interrupting. How he answered with indignation. Now, to see something so amazing and then be upset, it just shows where their heart is. It shows, how they are a slave to the external. I think, a movie comes to mind where the king, he had a son, the prince, and the prince, his wife was being prepared, right? And how all these females were being presented unto him, but he fell in love with one poor servant girl. And no, it was against all things for him to be with her, and they were insisting no. But then I think it was the mother that spoke to the king and said, you are the king, you have the authority to change these things. It's where was his authority to overrule something like this? Where was his inside of him to appreciate the beauty of this thing? Like I said, where is his mind to ask questions? How did you do this? What am I doing that I wasn't able to do this? What, are you about that I am not, that I can be like you? He was, asking the wrong questions. I think people, when you see when it's not you, it's easy to say stuff like this. If it was him, I guarantee you he wouldn't be saying this. If it was his son or daughter, he would not be saying this. So, we also see element of neglect and negligence here. Being, the ruler of the synagogue, no doubt. I mean, I know that, was it Paul that said, is any sick? Let him call for the elders and anoint him with oil. And then, the prayer shall heal him. Did we, see healings like that? I mean, I know Elijah and that child that died, or was it Elisha? And he brought him back to life, right? Naaman the Syrian with the leprosy. How many healings did we see, right, of people in the Old Testament? Maybe also then they were a slave to what? Their environment. Maybe never having seen, things like this. It was so far out. But then again, here you see this thing. Where's your wonder? Where's your amazement? You're gonna meet this thing with hardening of heart. And that's why he said, unless you enter in as little children, you shall in no wise enter in. Because you see that law, it covers things like this. Because there's no way you're gonna see this woman and she's in the synagogue. Jesus, he came there and saw her. The question could be asked, how comes she's been there and you have nothing to say about this? But Jesus, he brought in the New Testament, which was all these things. Did we, in the Old Testament, did we see them contending against a devil, and his demons? We didn't see, really see that. Jesus, he brought that, aspect in, even casting out these devils and demons. So he answered with straight indignation. He was an old dog, unwilling to learn new tricks, because that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. So, this is just a blind computer. You know that with computers, you have to program them to do anything you want them to do. You can't tell a computer to do something without having it being programmed first. And this guy, he's behaving like that. Because no, he needs to be taught, about healing and deliverance and these things, for him to, catch on. And that's why he said that even the publicans, go into the kingdom of God before you. Because, they heard, John. And they heard, they hear these things, but you choose not to. So therefore he said unto them, there are 6 days that men ought to work. Come in them and be healed, and not on the Sabbath. So now he's hitting them straight with just the law of Moses, the commandment. So, if you understand in any court of law is given. But why do you need a judge, right? You need a judge. Well, first of all, to establish these things. If something happens for the first time, then we're going to need a judgment. And usually, all similar cases they follow the judgment of that one. That's why things like Roe v. Wade needed to be overturned because in order for them to go the opposite, they gotta change the first thing. So this man being unwilling and unable to establish or even to overturn something like that. And it also shows, I think, a degree of cowardice, being unwilling to stand for something that's right because of fear of the consequences. Because if he was to, be of a mind to accept this, then he could face possible, kickback. How many would accuse him, as they did Jesus, right? How many would come and speak against him, for having had the Sabbath broken? And, we see this is really a degree of cowardness, being unwilling and afraid to stand. And how he, blind repeated this law. So like I said, judges, they established the first law that all other cases follow. And, they're needed to, inspect the quality of the details, surrounding. Is there anything worthy, to be given or granted an exception? That's why you have judges, right? And they judge, righteously and with ethics and morals and integrity and fairness. If you're just gonna be blindly repeating laws, then we don't need a human being. We could just have computers. You just present your case, and the computer just decide based on these programmed things. Not having a heart to think and reason. Not having a heart for mankind and humanity to come and be healed on those days and not on the Sabbath. And we see Jesus answering him, right? The hypocrite. So now he uses an animal, right? Compare to a human being. I was watching, on social media, this guy, he was showing how, a bald eagle, if you touch the egg, break it, destroy it, or even the eagle, it's what $100,000 fine, and you can, face jail time. But then, how, the state of abortion, how, it's being done, and there's no, the care that's being given to this bald eagle, what's missing, from human beings. So, he uses this animal, right? Showing how on the Sabbath, that they do loose their animals, their ox or their ass, from the stall and lead it to water, to drink water. Now you understand that this animal probably has been working, throughout the week. If he's saying that 6 days men ought to work, we know that the Sabbath is their day off. Do they work on Sundays, the first day? Is there a 6 day work week as opposed to our 5 day Monday to Friday work week? Because this ox has been working, right? So you understand that they're used to plow fields and to transport things. And for him to have worked the entire week, this ox or ass donkey, and then on his only rest day, he's not giving no water. How cruel is that? How cruel would that be? So they can receive that premise. But then, when it comes to a human being being loose, they have all these things. Something is lost in translation. What was supposed to have been, translated, for the human as it was for these animals, it was lost for some reason. All right, so here we are, still in the early parts of the 13th chapter of Luke, where it started out saying, there were some present at that season who told him of the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. Jesus answered and said unto them, suppose ye that these Galileans were sinners above all Galileans, because they suffered such things? I tell you, nay, but except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish. Or those 18 in Siloam upon whom the tower fell and slew them, suppose ye that these men were sinners above all the men in Jerusalem, because they suffered these things? I tell you, nay, but except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish. And he spake also this parable unto them. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit thereon, and found none. Then he said to the dresser of the vineyard, Lo, these 3 years I come seeking fruit on this fig tree, and find none. Cut it down, why cumbereth it the ground? But the keeper answered and said, Lord, let it alone this year also, that I may dig around it and dung it. And if it shall produce fruit, well, and if not, then afterward thou shalt cut it down. And it came to pass, he was in one of the synagogues, teaching on the Sabbath day. All right, so then we pick up right here where it says, and behold, there was a woman with an issue of infirmity 18 years that was bowed down and could in no wise lift herself. So, we see this woman, we cut right to this woman. So, Jesus, he was teaching, right? Because it said he was in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath day teaching. So he was up there. I thought that it was the ruler of the synagogue teaching, right? So, all right, so we're not given, did she walk in and see him teaching? When he showed up, was she already there? Jesus, he chooses how to do what he does. And I think that, it would be best for him to wait, because then more people show up, and more people, they'll see these things and they'll believe on him. They'll understand that, that their faith is real, that, these spiritual things, that they are real. It's easy to receive things of the natural, but things of the spirit are unseen. That's why he said, the things that are unseen are spiritual and eternal, but the things that are seen are natural and temporary. So this adds fuel to their faith. And with so many reasons to doubt in the world, to not believe, and to go along with what everybody else is saying, how precious are these nuggets? And how he said unto them, blessed are the eyes that see the things that you see, because I say unto you, many prophets and kings have desired to see the things that you see and have not seen them. If a ticket price was to be charged for these things that he's doing, the Son of God, the Messiah, what would these have to pay for these tickets? But we know that Jesus, he's not like that, and he's giving these things away, in front of them. So if he had gone in and healed her, then how many would have missed this moment? No doubt she was popular and the people knew her, so they would have seen her, but they would have missed what he did, and they would have to I guess figure it out in their minds what took place, or people could have told them. So this woman, she's introduced having this issue of infirmity, 18 years. Now that's a long time to suffer with something, and I would say, did this progress? It probably did. She probably like started bending down, because it says that she's bent over, right? So she probably started tilting, little by little, month after month, year after year, until it came to such a place where it reached its max. It couldn't go any further. There was not anything left for her to go. And I asked the question, is she mobile? Is she walking? She's in the synagogue. Obviously, she can't sleep there and stay there. And then, you'd also ask the question, why is she in the synagogue? She's been there so many times, nobody has been able to help her. Is she a believer? Is she here to hear the doctrine? Is she here to hear the exhorting and what they have to say and teach? Sometimes when the standard is dropped and you don't know any better, you accept it. Because, knowing what Jesus came here to do, I guess one question she could ask is, how comes you guys were not able to help me? How comes, this man from Galilee, he came and as soon as he saw me, he helped me? Why, what's the difference between you and him? And, if there's a difference, how do I become a part of his ministry? How do I become a part of his church, his eyes, right? That, have eyes to see things like this and know what to do about it, know what it means. You guys, you don't even know what it means, and you're ready here to accuse and to tear down, what you were unable to do. So she was bent over and could in no wise lift herself. So, we understand that she couldn't, straighten up her body. Her caretakers, is not mentioned. Is she, who's, providing and taking care of this woman? Does she have children? Did she have, children in time before this, became so bad? Where, imagining that right now she would be unable to be delivered of any children. So we cut straight to this woman, and the stage is set for her. Now, lucky for her, she didn't have to cry out, like the rest of them. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me, or argue with him, saying, even the little dogs eat of the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Yeah, she didn't have to get his attention. He saw her. Her situation was bad enough. And at this point, was she, even believing that something like this could be done? We know Jesus, he's been doing his thing for a while. And no doubt she has heard, the miracles of him. Did she come there seeking him? It's a question I forgot to ask. All right, so the next verse says, and when the Lord saw her, he called her to him and said, Woman, thou art loose from thy infirmity. So, all right, is he in active teaching unto the people? Did he interrupt a teaching to address this woman? Was it right before he started teaching? Was it right after? We see him giving her his full attention, calling her. The difference in compassion when you're not, motivated by money. When you don't see the world as those that have and those that have not. When, all these things, they're not in you. You love to see people prosper and do well. When you have a genuine heart to love. Because, this ruler of the synagogue, a question he could expect him to ask is, what's in it for me? I'm breaking the Sabbath. What's in this thing for me? I always say, imagine if, they could do what Jesus did, what they would charge, right? The woman with the issue of blood spent all her living, on these physicians, and they couldn't help her. These, religious leaders, if they could do what he was doing, what would they be charging for this thing? They would quickly lose the Spirit of God, the foolishness that they would keep up. So he called her and she came. And such a statement, thou art loose from thine infirmity. So, we see, outrage in Jesus, right? This is a fight with words. How dare you, right? This ends right now. We see him staring this thing down, face to face. No smiling, no laughing. Him attacking this devil as the enemy that he is. Like I said, was this a devil, based disease, or was it? Because I know what comes next. Later down, it's gonna say that shouldn't this woman be, whom Satan has bound these years, right? And the authority that he speaks with. All right, so the next verse says, and he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. So a follow up, like I said, with a touch. He does, what he does, for the reasons, why he, does it. We don't really see him healing the same. Anytime, like a moment like this where an individual person, and it's not the whole multitude he's praying for, he always does something, unusual. When it's a bunch of people, coming onto him, how they all desire to touch him, virtue goes out of him and heal them all. How they all desire to touch the hem of his garment. So, interestingly, I would, like I said, ask if he did not touch her, would this thing have gone all the way through? Sometimes you have to see things through all the way to the end, depending on what you're dealing with. And that shows his improvising. He's a great improviser, right? How he declared this thing over her. We've seen him speak over people and they receive healing without any physical contact. But as we're gonna discover, no, they've already said 18 years. Sometimes when something has been there long enough, it requires a more persistent approach. The man with the legion in the mountain and the tombs, it was said that he had devils a long time, and when he commanded them to go out, they did not go. They besought him to be cast into the swine. That's how they ended up in the swine. They had been there so long. So we see an element of when something's been going on for a long time, persistence is needed. You might not get it on the first time. And with this woman, it's the same because he said, thou art loose from thine infirmity. That he laid his hands on her. And how she was, healed immediately. She was straightened. So now, imagine, sitting there and seeing this happen. And how the people must feel about him. How much, they must believe on him. How he's, proving who he is. Who he's not even saying that he is. Proving who he is. That he's not even saying that he is. Because every time they would ask him, he would say, thou hast said. Thou hast said. Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Thou hast said. We have ministers nowadays. They can't do anything, but yet still they have such talk. They have such they need to be respected. Like be careful how you gotta approach them a certain way. You gotta address them a certain way. Jesus, he's here proving that he's everything that he's not even telling them that he is. And how, we can all look at something or take away from that, is can be so different. That's why, like at an accident, how they'll ask multiple people what they saw. Because somebody, he's going to come and say something. Next person's going to say something else. And, when you put all these things together, then you can get, a more, overall picture. Certain elements that keep repeating, certain things that happen, right? And, with Jesus, his healing is immediate, right? And we don't see a recovery time. He didn't tell her to go and lay in bed for 6 weeks. I'm pretty sure that she was able to walk. How difficult it must have been. How atrophied her muscles have been, with none use for all these years. But yet still, I bet she was able to walk as if she was walking the whole time. So we see, the restoration of Jesus. How, it put things in such a place that, they were better, if that thing had never happened in the first place. All right, so the next verse says, then the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. Therefore he said unto all the people, there are 6 days in which men ought to work. Come in them therefore and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. So this man, he's addressing Jesus before the people. He's not rebuking him individually. He didn't take him aside and speak to him. But, this man, he's, attempting to even humble Jesus. Because, if he's able to humble Jesus, what does that say about his authority? I think that people in life, they'll try you, like this. You just got to be careful how you walk. Don't put yourself in a position to be tried. Be on your guard. Know how to answer people when they come at you with certain things. So he was making a statement here. He was gonna, put this before the whole people. And I guess, rightly so you could say, because he is the ruler of the synagogue. And if he felt that a rule was being broken, then he addressed it before all the people, and not having to individually now this thing, spreads and then everybody starts doing it. But, he was, in the wrong heart and mind frame and mindset. He was in the wrong, inner, thoughts, inner values was wrong. Looking at this moment, that's all he could get from it. That he had healed her on the Sabbath. That's like looking at, the Mona Lisa and, just calling it a face, right? How people love that painting, how, they'll describe it, the aesthetics, the beauty, the story that it tells, how they can tell you the patterns, the things that are used to, make that thing, how they can describe it, with such, passion. This man, he looked at this and all he saw was somebody being healed on the Sabbath. And, that just shows in life how, knowledge is always there. Knowledge is always there, but it requires work. Knowledge requires work. and wisdom. Because it takes work for him to ask him, how did you do that? It takes work for him to look in himself. How come I was unable to do that? How comes I was unable to see that? How comes I didn't know that that was possible? It takes work, for him to go on this journey and have the Holy Spirit. Like, it would take for him to do these things. He would have to let go of so many things that he's holding onto right now. That's causing this right now. All these things that require work, and it's easier to just complain. I think that we think that force, sometimes, answers all things if we're indignant enough or if we're self-justified enough. No, you get left behind. If you're indignant and self-justified enough, you get left behind, bottom line. But we have this belief as humans that it pushes us through this thing that requires patience and enduring. It requires progressing in stages. You progress a little bit here, you progress a little bit there. This thing that requires advancing through research, through trial and error, through many failures and reattempts. You just want to call through it with being indignant and self-justified. You get left behind. How comes I wasn't able to do this? How did you do this? Is the questions he should have been asking. This reminds me of when the disciples came to him saying, Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name, and we forbade him because he followed not after us. When they should have been asking, this guy, how did you do it? Because they just got done being unable to cast the devil out of that man's son when he came down from the transfiguration. And this guy, he's doing the same thing. So it just shows how people will use their authority, shut you down, even when they are in a high position, because this man, he was the owner of the synagogue, right? The ruler of the synagogue. So his authority in the synagogue was higher than Jesus. And he had the authority, and he was trying to shut him down. This shows how those in authority, how they'll use their authority to undermine something that they can't do. The disciples did it, and now he's doing it. All right, so the last verse says, but Jesus answered and said, thou hypocrite, which of you shall have his ox or ass on the Sabbath and not loose him from the stall and lead him away to watering? So you have to understand the reasoning of Jesus and the mind. How, I think for us, moving from, connecting these two thoughts, right? How many things are in between to get from, this woman being healed, comparing it to animals being loose on the Sabbath. How many steps, how many, intermediaries are in the middle that you have to reason, point by point by point. And, we see Jesus, how, his mind is dynamic and how he can, jump these things, being filled with all wisdom, because I think that a person listening to this could say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Because it takes so many things in between. It would seem as if you're talking about two different things, but he connects them so, effortlessly, right? So he goes right to the animals. Which of you having an ox or an ass, a donkey or a cow, pretty much, loose him from the stall and water and give him water? This animal has been working all week, and don't tell me, no, it's a Sabbath. You get to rest, but the animal is resting with no water. What is the point of resting with no water? Water. The rest is to regenerate and to recuperate, right? The water is to flush out, I believe, is it myoglobin, when muscles, they work hard, and all the other toxic things that build up, from you working hard in, your body. The water is, there to flush these things out, to help with healing and inflammation, all these things. To have this animal healing, with no water, is really cruel, right? And he's equating this to this because she's been suffering this thing so long. And instead of appreciating the beauty of this thing, you choose instead to find fault. I'm Straw Greenhorn.